Hey GBC family, my name's Adam. I'm one of the pastors here, and I just want to welcome you to our weekend virtual services. Thanks so much for joining us. I just also want to make mention of a few quick things. First of all, if you've not registered to receive the Loop, which is our weekly email newsletter, I would highly encourage you to do that. Simply go to graca2.org/loop and get yourself signed up for that. There's so much information that goes out on a week-to-week basis, as well as that's the only way to actually sign up for our live and in-person services here at our Maple campus at 9 a.m. and 11 o'clock a.m. on Sundays. Every Monday morning, the Loop will go out and it'll have the Sign Up Genius link, and you can click on that and get yourself or your family unit signed up, and we'll look forward to seeing you live and in person as soon as we possibly can. Also, I want to make mention that this coming Sunday is the first Sunday that we will be having live registration for our grace groups that will be kicking off early this fall, Lord willing. And so there's a couple different ways for you to register for that. If you are live here and in person, you can do that right here in our new foyer and get yourself signed up and registered for a grace group. Or you can simply reply to the loop that I just mentioned a couple moments ago. There's information about grace groups in there. You can reply to that and get registered that way as well. Lastly, we do believe that giving is an act of worship and sacrifice, and if you feel led to give and called to give, you can do that a few different ways. You can give in person at our services in our giving boxes, or you can send your tithes and offerings to our 1300 South Maple Road address. That's Ann Arbor, Michigan 48103. Or you can give online a couple different places at graca2.org/give or therefugechurch.org/give. Again, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. We love you, and we look forward to seeing you again really soon.
A little over a week ago, I officiated a wedding for this awesome GBC couple. And as you might imagine, there were some challenges for them to create a socially distanced wedding, especially with the seating chart. But during the ceremony, I took a couple cracks at the groom's expense. And as I kind of poked fun at him a little bit, the congregation there, they sort of chuckled in their polite sort of wedding way, and everything was fine, because you sort of expect, and it's acceptable, to tease the groom a little bit at a wedding. It is not acceptable to tease or to make fun of the bride at the wedding. Now, I didn't stick around for all the speeches, so occasionally during those speeches, there can be some barbs that go back and forth. But even during the speeches by the closest friends, it's usually like, oh, the groom and the bride. Good luck, bride, you have to deal with this guy. That's usually how it goes. I mean, can you imagine how awkward it would be if the officiant standing before the couple and the congregation looked at them and looked around and said, thank you everybody for being here. You all look wonderful, especially you, groom. You look so great today. I mean, she's a lucky lady. And bride, you look okay. I mean, even if it was completely intended as a joke, it would not go over well. It would be the proverbial lead balloon, because you don't make fun of the bride. You don't talk down to her. In fact, if anything, you lift her up while you kind of talk down to the groom. The person who'd probably be the most offended by a joke at her expense would, in fact, be the groom. I haven't met the groom yet who really cares about him being the center of attention and being really good looking on the day of his wedding. That isn't to say that I haven't met grooms who wanted to look nice. It's just that I've never met the guy who had dreamed his whole life about how he would look in his wedding tux, or who bought magazines since he was like 12, looking at other guys wearing suits and like, oh, I want to look like that someday. I've never met that. He probably is out there somewhere, but I haven't met him. He cares about looking okay, but what he really cares about is the beauty of his bride. How do we talk about a beautiful bride? How do we talk about the church, which is actually described as the bride of Christ? How do we think about the church? Is it something where we kind of poke fun at, make fun, always see like the flaws, or do we see the bride as the groom sees the bride? We are in week 2 of our Essential sermon series. We've been playing on this word essential because it's big in our culture about what's essential and what isn't essential. And again, I'm not picking on our government officials about how they've used this word. They've had very difficult decisions to make. But while everybody's been arguing about whether or not the church is essential, they're all focused on the word essential, when in reality, the word to really pay attention to is the word church. And what is the church? Last week, we looked at the definition of the church and the Greek word ekklesia, which is the group of people that are called out of the world and who have been called to God. It appears about 114, 115 times in the New Testament. The first time it appears in the New Testament is in the book of Matthew. Jesus and his disciples, they had been traveling to a place called Caesarea Philippi, which is 30 to 40 miles away from Galilee, where they normally hung out. By car, it takes about an hour to get up there as you're driving up that way. On foot, it would have taken a day or two. And Jesus took his disciples there because he wanted to teach them an incredible lesson about who he is and also about his bride, the church. And so when he went up there and they had this amazing, powerful discussion, and someday we'll be able to dive into that text specifically, but it's this just naturally beautiful area. But it was also a place that was terribly idolatrous. In fact, some of the practices of idol worship there were so bad that there's a spot there, which we have an image of for you. There's a spot there that was known as the gates of hell, or the doorway to Hades. And so Jesus took them on this long journey to this place so that he might talk to them about his church. And after Peter utters this amazingly profound statement about who he believes Jesus to be, Jesus looks at him and says, "You're right. You are right in what you say. And I will build my ekklesia, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Well, he thinks pretty highly of the church, doesn't he? This group of people that Jesus is gathering together, this group of people that are going to fulfill such an essential and important role that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And those are some powerful words. One of the most beautiful statements about the church is found in 1 Peter. And this is 1 Peter chapter 2, and this is where I want us to land today. And this is what Peter says. Now, he's talking to a handful of churches in what is modern-day Turkey, and it's these churches that were facing all kinds of persecution and difficulties, and he wanted to encourage them. He wanted to say to them, look, you're living in an incredibly difficult place at an incredibly difficult time. I want you to understand just how important of a role you play in this difficult world where you live. And so here's what he says in 1 Peter 2. As you come to him, that's Jesus, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Peter was talking to these churches and he said, listen, you are where you are for a reason. You've been planted there. He's remembering back to when Jesus said, I'm going to build this church and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And so Peter is saying to these churches, listen, I know you're living in a tough place and during tough times, but I need you to know who you are. Don't talk down about the bride. Now think about just how essential of a role you are meant to play in this world. You know, a lot of churches fall into the trap of extremes, and they kind of go to one end or the other in how they relate to the world. And on one end, I'll call it, it's been talked about a lot of different ways through different articles and scholarly opinions, but I would call them bunker churches on one side and blend-in churches on the other side. The bunker church is the church that just looks at the world around it and it focuses on the gates of Hades and goes, that's so scary, culture is so scary, the world is so scary, things are so different than I remember, that if anything, what we need to do is just get as far away from this world as we can and make ourselves as safe as possible. And so they have language and dress codes and all kinds of doctrinal minutia that they make it so that they can get about as far away from culture as possible and get in their bunker. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Village. It was out years and years and years ago, so if I'm spoiling it for you, you're a little behind. But in the movie, this group of people created these monsters in the woods in order to scare their children to stay close to home, essentially. And they were in a bunker of sorts. There are churches that some of us grew up in that are bunker churches. We weren't interacting with the world like a radiant warrior bride. We were in a bunker of sorts. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the blend-in churches. They're not in the bunker so much. They're just trying to blend in with the culture around. Maybe also for fear of being rejected by culture. They just want to blend in and look like everybody else. And so doctrine, who needs the doctrine, right? And like whatever the issue du jour is of the day, they kind of latch onto that, and they just do whatever they can to not really distinguish themselves from the world around them. What's fascinating is both the bunker church and the blend-in church, they both are trying to just be safe. The bunker's trying to be safe from the culture in the world. The blend-in's trying to be safe in the culture in the world. And that is not at all what the church has been called to be. One of those two things. We are called to step in as the people of God and fulfill this important role, like living stones, a spiritual house, a holy priesthood offering spiritual sacrifices, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, the people of God. There's some essential roles that are being fulfilled here. So let's look at 3 just quick essential roles that are being fulfilled just by the church according to this text. The first is essential sacrifice. It says a holy priesthood offering spiritual sacrifices, essential sacrifice. Anne Lamott tells the story of an 8-year-old boy and his sister had leukemia. And the parents were trying to figure out that and go through that whole process. And so at some point, the little girl was going to need a blood transfusion. And so they asked the 8-year-old boy, can we test your blood to see if it'll be a good match for your sister? And he said, yeah, that'd be okay. So they tested his blood. And then as they found out that it was, in fact, a very good match for her to have a transfusion, they went back to the 8-year-old boy and they said, listen, buddy, could we have some of your blood for your sister? Because it would really help her live to have some of your blood. So the little boy in the story says, I'll need to think about it. And so he went to bed that night. And the next day he goes, yeah, I'll give her my blood. And they said, great. And so they went to the hospital and they laid him on the gurney and they started to draw blood from him in order to be able to give it to his sister. And as they did it, the little boy looked up at the doctors and he said, so how much longer until my blood runs out and I die? And the little boy thought in that moment that he was being asked to give everything. And he was willing to do that out of love for his sister. Only one has ever given everything, who has given their blood so that we might live, and that's Jesus. And so we know when Peter says, you're like priests making sacrifices, he's not saying we are supposed to atone for the sins of this world. It is our blood that will save humanity. That's not what he's saying. Jesus has made that sacrifice once and for all. So that can't be what he's saying. In Hebrews 10, verse 11, it says, and every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting for that time until his enemies should be made a footstool of his feet. For by a single offering he was perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice. But what is the sacrifice then that you and I are supposed to make? If the church is like holy priests making this essential sacrifice, what is it? Well, in Romans 12, Paul says, present your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. In everything we do, with our body, whether we're playing basketball or preparing taxes or changing a diaper or making dinner, we are supposed to do it in such a way that we're actually offering up our body to be used for God's work. That our presence in this world is there so that we might lay down ourselves, our own sort of dreams, desires, whatever, for the good of the rest of the world. Back to the wedding for just a second. As a pastor who officiates weddings, I've mentioned this I think before, but I've come to view my role as almost like a glorified server, waiter person. I mean, I'm like I'm performing this essential role for the day, and yet nobody cares about the pastor at a wedding. Really? I'm not the focus. I mean, Jesus is always the focus, but beyond Jesus, you have this bride and groom who are making this amazing commitment to one another, and you have their families, you have all these people. The only way that the pastor gets focused on is if he really messes something up. Nobody really cares. Afterwards, after the ceremony, I might have 3 people say, "Hey, nice job, pastor." I say, "Well, thank you." And then it's over. Nobody really cares. And yet I'm still there giving my time, giving what I can, and laying it down. And it's an essential service to the world. In many ways, that's what we're called to do. Not be the center of attention, not be the focus, not need all the accolades, but to find ways to use our lives to serve the people that are around us. It is essential that we sacrifice ourselves in this way. In order for us to understand what this essential sacrifice looks like, I want to challenge us to be praying this week. God, what are you asking me to lay down? Where is it in my life that you're calling me to a deeper level of service? We are called, as the church, essentially in this world, to make this essential sacrifice. Jesus did the essential sacrifice, but we too sacrifice ourselves in a way. Second is the essential proclamation. We give our lives to be used by God in whatever way he sees fit, but then we have this essential proclamation, this song, this declaration, this way of sharing with the world exactly who this Jesus is. We are called, this word proclamation, which seems like a Bible word, actually this particular version only used once in the whole New Testament, is really to make God famous. So it's almost a marketing thing. It's to lift up who God is and his excellencies, the thing that he has done, to let the whole world know around, oh, this is what's happening. This is what it's all about. In the middle of April, kind of in the midst of pandemic stuff, 2 of my boys had birthdays coming up. And so we have some neighbors that their kids are really close with ours, and we love this family. And so they reached out and they said, "Hey, are you going to be home in the afternoon, evening?" And we said, "Yeah." We're stuck, We're like, "Yeah, of course." And they said, "Cool. We're gonna swing by the end of the driveway. We'll give you a text right before we get there." So we didn't tell our kids, but they texted, "Hey, we're on our way." We said, "Cool." So we said, "Hey guys, I think we should walk outside." So we walked outside, and our neighbors came from their house down and around the corner and came down, and the kids had brought their instruments. Like horn, violin, whatever. And they began to play songs, including Happy Birthday, but they began to play songs for our children, standing at the end of the driveway while we were up in the driveway ways. And then at the end, they sort of cheered and they wished us happy birthday. And it was and they brought balloons. It was super cool, and it was very, very kind. Well, afterwards, when I would run into other neighbors who weren't in part of this group, they would say, "Whose birthday was it? What was it that was all about?" And then we would explain, "Oh, this is what it was." Do you see what our neighbors did that came around the corner? They were proclaiming something. They were sharing with the whole neighborhood something is going on here that's special. As the church, one of our roles in this world is this essential proclamation, this essential role of sharing with the world this amazing thing that is going on. Not kids' birthday is great, but this amazing thing that Jesus himself came to live among us as a human being and to lay his life down, truly lay his life down, so that we might live and then call us into this family called the church. We ought to be sharing that everywhere. People ought to go, "What are they all about? What is happening here?" Yes, I see we have police cars sometimes to help with the parking, but what is happening? What is the song that they're singing? This week, to help us think about this essential proclamation, just reflect on it. So pray on the sacrifice, reflect on the fact that we have been called out of darkness and into light. That the very thing that we celebrate is so much bigger and more beautiful than anything else. It is the good news of Christ. Reflect on that this week. Last essential thing that our church does here in this world is we are an essential difference. We're an essential difference. We are called to live our lives so differently that when other people see the way that we live in community with one another and in the communities where we are, that people look at us and they think, that's weird. And when they see how weird we are, it actually may make them like persecute us or make fun of us or something. I mean, if you look at 1 Peter and kind of the language that's used here, he talks about how they were living in a culture where it was like people would call them out as evildoers almost. And there was real persecution that was happening against these Christians. But we played this role of this essential difference. It's a little bit like when you're cooking something and you need offsetting flavors to kind of make it taste just right. I mean, the church is called to be the light and salt. And so we're called to be this kind of very different community that functions in this brilliant, bright way in our community. In the first century, we're going to talk about this more in the fall, but the church was very different than the Roman Empire at large. I mean, it may have had some things that are similar, but it's very, very different. And as a result, people would look at the church and go, oh, that's so weird. They're so different. They are way too diverse racially. They care way too much about babies and the unborn. They're way too offended by the violence in our culture. You know, that they're way too kind to their wives. They're way too committed to these sexual ethics of theirs. They think that their way is the only way. They're too generous with the poor folks. And all of these things about the church that were so different than the culture around, it was an essential difference. It was showing a different way. It was showing the way of Jesus. This is what we've been called to, and it doesn't align in any perfect way with the world at large right around us. We are called to have this essential kind of difference in the way that we live. In order to help us remember this essential difference, if we were to pray on it and reflect on it, I would say brag on it this week. Your application is brag about the church. No, don't brag about the pastor. Don't brag about like the video or something. Brag about what you've seen different about the people of God. Brag about how people have come around you in times of need. Brag about how generous you've seen the small group or your church be. I mean, brag about that. It's really hard because so often it's like, well, I don't want to say about how I'm so different and like virtue signal and all that stuff. That's not what I'm saying. Consider the church, maybe where you grew up, this church, your small group, and find ways to lift up this essential, beautiful difference in what you see in the people of God. Brag on it this week. God is using the church to continue the ministry of Christ. It is not, there really isn't a plan B. It is like the church is plan A. And this local church is the hope of the world. It is the bride of Christ that stands before the very gates of Hades. And it's unstoppable, and it's important, and it's absolutely essential. One last glance at the wedding, or weddings. I used to think that they were so boring. And now you're like, well, you don't because now you're the talker. And maybe that's true, because I'm pretty bored when I'm sitting out there and somebody else is talking, but I used to never want to go to the weddings. I didn't want to get all dressed up in the uncomfortable clothes. I didn't really want any part of that. But now when I go to weddings, there's so much hope in that moment. There's so much love and there's so much joy in those moments that in some ways it's a picture of life how it's supposed to be. Us at our best, committing ourselves to one another. So now when I have an opportunity to be part of a wedding or I'm invited to a wedding, instead of just, another wedding, I think, now here's the picture of how it's supposed to be. Here's actually a picture of the church. The church of people serving one another, of working hard to uphold one another, to commit themselves to each other in the service of Christ, and to have real joy and real peace, knowing that someday, right now, things are still going to fall apart and things are going to get messed up, but someday, things will be made right. Revelation 21 says this, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her family," or for her husband. Let's pray. Father, God, we are adorned for Christ. We are being built up, refined, taken care of for Christ. And God, I thank you that there is this family to which you've called us, that we get to be part of this together. God, it's an essential thing that we're doing in this world through a sacrifice of type, a spiritual sacrifice where we lay ourselves down. God, that you've called us not only to do that, but to have this essential proclamation where we share this good news of who Christ is. And God, where we are this essential difference in the world. We're just weird, but we're weird because we're showing a different way, and that's the way of Christ. So God, we look forward to that great day when we are reunited at the feast and the party in heaven. But until then, may we talk rightly, think rightly, pray rightly, and be the church rightly together. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Come, thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet, sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy unchanging love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, here there by thy help I've come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God, he to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be, and let that grace now, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. I'm prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. Oh, here's my heart, take and seal it for thy courts